All right, we're live from Occupy City Hall. Uh, okay, this is Rockford Reading. We are currently reading We Cant Wait by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This is a book that details the struggle that took place in Birmingham in 1963. And for anybody who may be watching this for the first time, watching the Rockford Reading portion of the May 30th Alliance content for the first time, I'll do a short explanation of what it is that we do with these Rockford Readings. For the Rockford Readings, a member of the May 30th Alliance goes through and reads a piece of literature and cross-references how the issues being presented in this piece of literature relate to the issues that are being presented to us currently in Rockford, Illinois. Also cross-referencing how tactics or ideology that's being written about in this piece of literature can be implemented, or how it interrelates to the issues that were, or how it can be implemented currently in 2021 in Rockford, Illinois, or how that ideology can be implemented in 2021 in Rockford, Illinois, or things that we can get from the ideology, or things that we can get from the tactics, or things we can get from the history and the things being spoken about. So that's how this segment works. I'll read through a portion. Sometimes it may be a paragraph, and then I may talk for 2 or 3 minutes about the paragraph that we just read. Sometimes it may be 2 or 3 pages, and then after the 2 or 3 pages, I'll speak about how the things in the 2 or 3 pages interrelate. And so really, it's just sort of a audio book with what's the word, with some reading comprehension. That's what I'm looking for. All right, we're on page 142 of We Cant Wait. Seen in perspective, the summer of 1963 was historic, partly because it witnessed the first offensive in history launched by black people along a broad front. The heroic but spasmodic and isolated slave revolts of the antebellum South have fused, more than a century later, into a simultaneous, massive assault against segregation. And the virtues so long regarded as the exclusive property of the white South, gallantry, loyalty, and pride, had passed to the black demonstrators in the heat of the summer's battles. In assessing the summer's events, some observers have tended to diminish the achievement by treating the demonstrations as an end in themselves. The heroism of the marching, the drama of the confrontation, became in their minds the total accomplishment. It is true that these elements have meaning, but to ignore the concrete and specific gains in dismantling the structure of segregation is like noticing the beauty of the rain but failing to see that it has enriched the soil. A social movement that only moves people is merely a revolt. A movement that changes both people and institutions is a revolution. And that's something that when we read previously through the last time I spoke about that some, and I'll go back and reiterate some of the things that I said yesterday when we read through this little portion. I'm overlapping some of the end of yesterday's with the beginning of today's, but I believe that is last year that it was a social movement that moved people. And I believe that as time has continued, and as the occupation has continued, and as we have gotten into a full year's worth of demonstrations and protests happening in this city, you can see how it's not only just people that's being moved, but institutions are being moved. It's a reason why we are, it was when the die-ins took place last year. They didn't take place at any institutions. They didn't. Well, we had one that was near the courthouse, but for the most part, they took place in the streets. They took place, Spring, Perryville, and in East State, Alpine areas, and they were further away. It was a thing to try to capture people, to try to get people specifically to pay attention to these issues. And as time has passed, we've protested at District 1. As time has passed, the occupation is taking place right now in front of City Hall. We've been we protested outside of the courthouse regularly. We've went to the institutions, and in going to these institutions, we have seen how these institutions have been altered or have altered some of the ways in which they go about doing things. And have we completely changed the institution? No. Have we completely changed people? No. But again, those are the things we have to be aiming for. We can't just solely aim to try to change people's minds, or just solely aim to to only awaken the consciousness, or only shake people out of their lethargy. We have to also make sure, as we're simultaneously doing that, that we are aiming at these institutions, that we are having dialogue about these institutions, about institutional racism, about the individuals who, once they become part of these institutions, opt into that institutional racism and opt into that institutional oppression. And again, as we do both of those things simultaneously, as we have a sign outside of City Hall of a young man that has been beat by the police department, so that way when people drive by City Hall, you are forcing people to be moved. And at the same time, the memorials that we have, what's up, bro? At the same time, these memorials that we have, as an example, outside of the institution of City Hall, watching the institution of the city of Rockford government destroy those memorials is attacking the institution. And in the attack of that institution, it's also exposing the type of institution it is. And once you attack the institution, expose the type of institution it is, and the institution can no longer do this exploitation and oppression and the racism. Those things can no longer happen covertly behind closed doors, and you force them to now do those things overtly in the open. That is when you can start getting people to the place to being prepared to change things. You see, as everybody drives down City Hall and they see this picture of Denzel Duvant, people are moved. And as those people are moved, and then as these institutions continue, and as we force these institutions to be moved and to no longer do their racism behind closed doors, or no longer do their racism behind these walls, and we force them to do those things in the open, those people who have been moved, they are now in the let's go by. Those people who have been moved, they are now in the right consciousness once they see these institutional wrongs, to be prepared to do something about them, to be prepared to not just revolt against them for one summer, but to wage a revolution against them permanently, until one system has been destroyed and another one has been created. And so I think that is something that we do have to make sure that we are always doing simultaneously. And so a social movement that only moves people is merely a revolt. But a movement that changes both people and institutions is a revolution. And again, just to add on to that, when you see City Market shut down the whole street, and you see that City Market is now being conducted in a way differently than it has been conducted in years past, you see that an institution is being changed. When you see that police officers, again, they're saying that body cameras are supposed to be coming. We're still waiting for that process to get all the way through. But if those body cameras come, that will be a form of change to the institution. The same thing, the video footage of Faustin Guaitigo being released after he was murdered, that is something that in the city of Rockford and in Winnebago County was unprecedented. That is the changing of the institution. We stand right now where the mayor won't even say the names of the victims of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. The first time that he does, whatever point that is, he's got 4 more years of service to render. And in that time, because they're not addressing these issues, there will be continuous macro aggressions of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice enacted into this community. There will be more victims. And at some point, he will be forced to say the names of these victims, and that will be an institutional change that we have brought about. And so those are forms of institutional change that we have to continue to work to. And those are forms of some of the types that we have gotten. And again, when we talk about people changing, before somebody can change, they have to be open to the issue. They have to be brought aware to the issue. Awareness has to be brought to the issue. And we have continuously, and not just we as the May 30th Alliance or us as protesters or organizers, but community members as well. We live in a city in which we should be proud of the fact that we have not allowed this issue to regress to the back of the consciousness of the community, or regress to the margins of the society. This has been an issue continuously since the murder of George Floyd in this city. It has been a topic of conversation continuously since the murder of George Floyd in this city. Has it been Has it had the impotence that I believe it should have? No, it has not always had that impotence. But I believe the fact that it has not disappeared, the fact that we've been outside of here for 260 days, the fact that while being outside of here for 260 days, different members of the community have come and assisted in whichever manner that they can. The fact that when people get arrested, people are still donating money to bond people out. The fact that people continue to share these posts. The fact that people continue to put hashtags in news in newspaper and some of the news media, social media posts. The fact that all of these things continue to happen, the fact that people again continue to engage in this conversation as a community, that is a success. That is a step forward, because in times past these things would happen and then they would regress back to the margins. They would regress back to the shadows, and we have not allowed that to happen here in Rockford, Illinois. And I believe that in the county and in the Winnebago County area, and I do believe that that is the first step towards getting towards change for something, is not allowing yourself to not just be reacting to something, but to be constantly and continuously waging a revolution against something. Let's get back into this. The summer of 1963 was a revolution because it changed the face of America. Freedom was contagious. Its fever boiled in nearly 1,000 cities, and by the time it had passed its peaks, many thousands of lunch counters, hotels, parks, and other places of public accommodation had become integrated. Slowly and unevenly, job opportunities opened up for black people, though these were still more impressive in their promise than in their immediate numbers. In the larger northern cities, a more significant change in employment patterns took shape. Many firms found themselves under fire, not because they employed black people, but because they did not. Accustomed to ignoring the question, they were forced by a sudden overwhelming presence into a hasty search for absolving tokens. A well-trained black person found themselves sought out by industry for the first time. Many black people were understandably cynical as the door to opportunity was flung open to them as if they were but recent arrivals on the planet. Nevertheless, though the motives were mixed, the black people could celebrate the slow retreat of discrimination on yet another front. The sound of the explosion in Birmingham reached all the way to Washington, where the administration, which had firmly declared that civil rights legislation would have to be shelved for 1963, hastily reorganized its priorities and placed a strong civil rights bill at the top of the congressional calendar. The task of turning the bill into law still lies ahead, as I write, and the task of conforming custom to law must follow. But the surest guarantee that both will be achieved in the end is found in the massive alliance for civil rights that was formed in the summer of 1963. With initial success, every social revolution simultaneously does two things. It attracts to itself fresh forces and strength, and at the same time, it crystallizes the opposition. This revolution conformed to the pattern. The positive growth of the movement was spectacular. Sympathy and support from the white and black sources accelerated in geometric proportions. The number of SCLC affiliates jumped from 85 to 110. Conservatively estimated, more than 1 million Americans attended solidarity demonstrations in Washington, D.C., New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Cleveland, Chicago, and Detroit, to mention but a few. Equally significant, though less direct in expression, hundreds of national, civic, religious, labor, and professional organizations speaking for tens of millions went on record in resolutions of sympathy with the unfolding movement. Because such revolutions have for so long been merely lofty expressions of empty eloquence, embattled black people might justifiably had depreciated their value. I fucked that sentence up. Because such resolutions have for so long been merely lofty expressions of empty eloquence, embattled black people might justifiably have depreciated their value. However, a new quality enriched these recent declarations and gave them dynamic meaning. Recognizing that the movement was now dominantly one of direct nonviolent action, for the first time they specifically called upon their supporters to join the demonstrators on the line of active struggle. This was commitment, not comment. And then I think that's an important thing to point out. I think that that's one of the reasons that that's one of the things that I do believe, again, as time passes, is sometimes time must pass, and the thought pattern of the community and the society must alter some. But I do believe a time will come where people will understand that walking on the crosswalk even though they may try to criminalize it, that this is a nonviolent direct action, or using chalk or having the megaphone and the siren. And since it is a nonviolent direct action, a time will come when people stop only just commenting or only just sharing things on social media or only just having dialogue about it, and people will commit to it, and people will come in person, and people will be there 10 toes, as opposed to being, which again, it is a process that we are in. We can't, you don't want to rush the process. You want to trust the process. And so I believe a time will come. And I believe the community needs to see, individuals and collectives and organizations, put their money where their mouth is, in the sense of, going out and being on the ground, being feet on the ground, and showing that example, so that way, again, people can, the consciousness of the society can change, and people can become more apt to participating in these direct actions. Sheriffs and police officers found themselves grappling with an utterly novel situation. Nationally renowned religious leaders were taking their place in jail cells along with the ordinary black people. Sitting in the patrol wagon between the black domestic and the truck driver was the erect figure of the national head of the Presbyterian Church. Catholic priests and rabbis of Jewish congregations took their place on the front lines as the Old and New Testament ethic of social justice flamed with the fire that once before had transformed the world. The crystallized opposition of the segregationists was not unexpected, but we had only dimly foreseen the resistance that came from another quarter. Victor Hugo has spoken of the, quote, madmen of moderation, end quote, who are, quote, unpaving hell, end quote. The descendants of Hugo's moderates appeared in the fall of 1963, bearing banners inscribed with the message, order before justice. For the most part, these moderates counted themselves as friends of the civil rights movement. Certainly, they were in no sense moral bedfellows of the forces of segregation and violence. But they were now wrestling with the logic that an earlier, more passive movement had never forced them to question. They had long settled on a simple compromise, one easy to accept and to live with. They could countenance token changes, and they had always believed these would make the black people content. They were not asking them to stay in their old ghetto. They were ready to build a brand new ghetto for them with a small exit door for a few. But the breath of the new movement chilled them. The black people were insisting upon the mass application of equality to jobs, housing, education, and social mobility. They saw a full life for a whole people. These moderates had some distance in step with the thundering drums, but at the point of mass application, they wanted the bugle to sound a retreat. And so again, that's just another example of how, this is what we deal with in Rockford a lot, is these tokenisms, these small capitulations or these small compromises that these institutions are willing to make, as long as their status quo is not truly altered, as long as the power structure is not truly shaken, as long as the false concept of quote unquote white supremacy is not truly altered. And again, that's the 60% minority, 60% women in minority businesses at City Market. That is allowing black faces to put on the Juneteenth event that the city is sponsoring. Those are all small capitulations and small tokenisms that are given in hopes to make the masses of black people stay calm or stay quiet or stay content with the place in which they're in. And then every now and then you, again, let a few slip through the cracks, let a few slip through the windows, or let a few rise up higher in the ranks, but you keep the masses at bay. And for so long in Rockford, that has been what has kept us from actually progressing, kept us from actually attaining community power, is that these acts of tokenisms have worked to pacify our people. And I believe we are at a place now where we won't be pacified. I believe we're at a place now where it is all or nothing. And I believe that the generation that is coming up, after me, they have the internet, they have access to so much information that this false idea of Americanism has been sold to them or has been pushed to them, and they are waking up and seeing at every turn the the lack of living up to those ideals that this nation has done, and this city has done in specific. Resentment, impatience with militancy and aloofness began to overcome the earlier enthusiasm. It would be easy merely to denounce this mood or ignore it, but it would be the greater wisdom to understand it. These men and women, despite their hesitations, are not our main enemies. They are our temporary obstacles and potential allies. They are evidence that the revolution is now ripping into roots. For too long, the depth of racism in American life has been underestimated. The surgery to extract it is necessarily complex and detailed. As a beginning, it is important to x-ray our history and reveal the full extent of the disease. The strands of prejudice toward black people are tightly wound around the American character. The prejudice has been nourished by the doctrine of race inferiority, yet to focus upon the black people alone as the, quote, inferior race, end quote, of American myth is to miss the broader dimensions of the evil. And these things that are being spoken of generally about America are very specific to Rockford as well. Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the indigenous people, were an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of black people on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles over racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today we have not permitted ourselves to reject or to feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore, all exalted. Our children are still taught to respect the violence which reduced the red-skinned people of an earlier culture into a few fragmented groups herded into impoverished reservations. This is in sharp contrast to many nations south of the border, which assimilated their indigenous people, respected their culture, and elevated many of them to high position. And so I want to speak on, the battery's getting low here, it's going to die here shortly, which is cool. But I want to speak on the fact that this is written in 1963, and the Washington football team just changed its name this year, or last year, excuse me. Was once the Washington Redskins, which is a derogatory name, derogatory term, basically a racial slur, an epithet for indigenous people of this nation. And that was what this team was named after. We live in Winnebago County, where they have a patch of an indigenous man that they wear as their emblem. Again, these are all things that are done as like symbols of victory, as symbols of dominance. They don't do that. That patch is not there because the institution of Winnebago County sheriff's deputies believe that they're similar to the indigenous people on there. That is it's like a trophy that they put on those patches. You know, the Washington football team have that as like a trophy. I think the Cleveland Indians is still a name of a team. Those are like those are constant reminders of a genocide that took place. There's no other way to put it. And you know, that was one of the forms of propaganda that have been used consistently. You know, even now we live in a nation which westerns come on TV regularly. Western movies are made regularly, and in those westerns, typically 9 times out of 10, the indigenous people are depicted as some sort of savages, are depicted as less than human, as subhuman. And again, this is the type of propaganda that this country is rooted in. This is how far back these things go, and how little they have truly been acknowledged in the society that we even live in today. Fuck Thanksgiving. It was upon this massive base of racism that the prejudice toward the non-white was readily built and found rapid growth. This long-standing racist ideology has corrupted and diminished our democratic ideals. It is this tangled web of prejudice from which many Americans now seek to liberate themselves without realizing how deeply it has woven into their consciousness. The roots are deep, and this condition in turn influences the character of the Black Revolution. Our history teaches us that wielding the sword against racial superiority is not effective. The bravery of the Indian employing spears and arrows against the Winchester and the Colt had ultimately to eventuate in defeat. On the other hand, history also teaches that the submission produces no acceptable result. Non-resistance merely reinforces the myth that one race is inherently inferior to another. Black people today are neither exercising violence nor accepting domination. They are disturbing the tranquility of the nation until the existence of injustice is recognized as a virulent disease menacing the whole society and is cured. The Black people's method of nonviolent direct action is not only suitable as a remedy for injustice, its very nature as such is that it challenges the myth of inferiority. Even the most reluctant are forced to recognize that no inferior people could choose and successfully pursue a course involving such extensive sacrifice, bravery, and skill. And I want to point out, I want to go back and double on, because some of these things, again, you can't wholly take any revolution or wholly take any movement or wholly take any ideology from the past or from a different country or a different area and just wholesale put it here and just 100% implement it into here. But what we can do is we can learn from what those movements or from what that ideology, from what it has done in other places or from how it has worked in other places. And we can figure out which pieces relate to us, or we can figure out which things can help us further the movement to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice in Rockford, Illinois. And I want to point out here where they say, Black people today are neither exercising violence nor accepting domination. And I believe that is true for the activists and the organizers and the protesters in the city of Rockford, Illinois, where we are not exercising violence, but we are also not accepting domination. We are not stooping to the same levels as the people, because again, people should understand that these police officers have assaulted multiple protesters, multiple demonstrators. They've shot people in the midst of these demonstrations, in the midst of the time these demonstrations have happened. I'm not saying they've shot demonstrators. They have shot demonstrators with pepper spray bullets and with rubber bullets and beanbag bullets. But they have shot citizens in the midst of these demonstrations happening. And so at every turn, violence is being used by the oppressor. Violence is being used by the institutions. But there has not been violence used in return by the demonstrators, but there also has not been compliance used by the demonstrators. There also has not been an acceptance to this domination, an acceptance to these illegal acts happening. And I believe that is the place that we have to try to get more of our members of the community to be at, a place in which we're not saying that when a police officer shoots an individual in the community, that it means that the next step should be the shooting of a police officer or the shooting of somebody that's racist or the destruction of a building. And again, the talking about property to people is something that is a conversation that should truly be had, because of the fact that we live in a nation they got the property by destroying the people. So it isn't even beyond the realm of thinking that once people are destroyed in this nation, that people will go to destroy property, because that would just be an understanding of history. But that is besides the fact, because that's not what is going on in Rockford, Illinois. In Rockford, Illinois, what is going on is that when violence has been perpetrated onto the community members, the demonstrators have not complied with that. The demonstrators have not just accepted that. Protesters and activists and again, other community members have not just accepted that. They have found ways to struggle against it. They have found ways. Again, that is the importance of, for every action, there must be an equal and opposite reaction. And as a community, we have to organize and mobilize, so that way, when these acts of state-sanctioned violence come down upon us as a community, we cannot accept the domination. Again, they are disturbing the tranquility of the nation. Again, that can be translated directly to Rockford, where somebody could say that we are disturbing the tranquility of the city until the existence of injustice is recognized as a virulent disease menacing the whole society and is cured. Again, the first step that Dr. King says is recognized. It must be recognized. And that is why it is important for the mayor to say the name of the individuals who are shot. That's why it's important for the powers that be to speak to these individuals' families, to not be worried about lawsuits or worry about legal jargon, but to humanize these issues. So that, because that is when you recognize that it's an issue. That is when you recognize that it's a problem. And then once that recognition has truly come into place, then we can start solving it. Then we can start fixing it. But if the doctor won't tell you that you have cancer, you will never be able to solve the cancer. If the doctor won't tell you that you have a broken arm or a fractured arm, you'll never be able to heal the broken arm or the fractured arm. And we live in a city that does not want to acknowledge that the arm is broken. We live in a city that will not acknowledge that there is cancer. We live in a city that won't acknowledge the existence of these issues, and we cannot solve the issues until it is an acknowledgement of them. There must be acknowledgement of the reasoning in which it is more likely, if you are black or brown, that police violence will be brought down upon you than if you are white. And that acknowledgement goes into racism. Then the same thing goes for the other intersectionalities. We must acknowledge the oppression of women. We must acknowledge the exploitation of women. We must acknowledge how deeply rooted that is into society, and then how that relates to police terrorism and mass incarceration and racial injustice. And then the same thing for members of the LGBTQIA plus community. We must understand how deeply rooted the oppression against that community is, how much exploitation, how much oppression, how much violence has been rooted onto that community, the dehumanization of the community, and understand why that has happened. And once we are at the place in which we are recognizing why all of these different intersections deal with these issues, then and only then can we get to a place of curing the issue, get to a place of solving the issue. And that's why the tranquility must be disturbed. Because again, these issues that we're talking about, they continue and they feed off of complacency. They don't need people. Racism is at a place because it's so deeply rooted in America. It don't need more people to be racist for it to continue and for it to get bigger. It just needs people to not be anti-racist. It just needs people to not struggle against racism. The same thing for police terrorism and mass incarceration. It doesn't need people to be pro-police or pro-mass incarceration. It just needs the people to not be anti-police or anti-mass incarceration. It doesn't necessarily need consent. It doesn't need you to consent to it. It just needs you to be complicit. We Americans have long aspired to the glories of freedom while we compromise with prejudice and servitude. Today, the black people are fighting for a finer America, and they will inevitably win the majority of the nation to their side because of hard-won heritage of freedom is ultimately more powerful than our traditions of cruelty and injustice. To those who argue that black people are becoming too aggressive and that their methods are alienating the dominant white population, there is a convincing answer. It was revealed in a survey conducted by Newsweek during the latter part of the summer of 1963. The surveyors interviewed a cross-section of whites in depth.